More fun with macros. We'll talk about how to apply formatting using a macro, switch between scenarios and custom views using a macro, using worksheet buttons to trigger macros, customizing buttons and other shapes that trigger macros, add macros to the ribbon and create your own ribbon, and adding a confirmation box to a macro. Formatting cells in workbooks can be a tedious process, especially if you have to format each worksheet in workbooks that you create. To save time and make things easier, you can use macros to format cells and worksheets simply by creating macros that do all the formatting for you. This way, you only apply the formatting once. After that, all you have to do is run the macro. A macro can contain as many steps as you want it to contain. You can create a macro that changes the font type, color, and size, and then also applies cell formatting and row and column sizes. In essence, you can create a macros to do all the formatting for you. We're going to create a macro that does the following things: changes font type, size, and color, sets a theme under the page layout tab, formats the cells to number with 3 decimal places, and creates a table in the worksheet. We're going to call this macro Sales Worksheet Formatting. Notice that we're going to store this macro in our personal macro workbook. This way, it's available in all workbooks and we can use it no matter what workbook we have open. Let's enter that name for our macro. And then save it in our personal macro workbook. Click OK. We can then record our macro. Earlier in this course, we learned to create scenarios, then move back and forth between scenarios and views. If we go to the Data tab, then click the What If Analysis button, then click on Scenario Manager, we can see all the scenarios that we created. We can select any of these scenarios, and then click Show to see the scenario in our worksheet. If we want to see another scenario, we go back to the Scenario Manager, select the scenario we want to view, and then click the Show button again. This is a lot of clicks. Instead, we can create a macro for each scenario and add a keyboard shortcut for each macro that we create. That way, we can view a scenario simply by using a keyboard shortcut. To create a macro for a scenario, go to the Developer tab, and then select Record Macro. Name the macro so you know what scenario it is, and specify a keyboard shortcut. You want to store the macro in the workbook. Click OK, then record yourself opening up the Scenario Manager, selecting your scenario, then clicking the Show button. Stop recording when you're finished. You can now view that scenario by running the macro. In addition to creating macros to view scenarios, you can also create macros to access custom views. Go to the View tab and select Custom Views. Select the custom view. If you don't have any, you can click on Add and type in a name for your custom view. Click on Custom Views. If you click the Show button, the custom view will appear in the worksheet. Instead of having to click the View tab, click the Custom Views button and then click Show. You can instead create a macro with a keyboard shortcut that will do all of this for you. To create the macro, click the Record Macro button on the Developer tab. Name the macro and then assign a keyboard shortcut to it. You want to store the macro in the workbook. Click OK and then record yourself going to the View tab, clicking on the Custom Views button, then clicking the custom view and then click on Show. Remember to stop recording when you're finished. You can now switch to that custom view by simply running the macro. In the last lesson, we learned how to create keyboard shortcuts to trigger macros. That said, the problem with creating keyboard shortcuts to trigger macros is that if you have a lot of macros, it can be hard to remember what keyboard shortcut triggers what macro. Imagine having 20 macros for one workbook, then trying to remember which macro triggers cell formatting. It can be impossible and actually make things more complicated. Macros are supposed to make things easier. Instead of creating keyboard shortcuts, you can create worksheet buttons instead. A worksheet button is just as it sounds. It's a button that you place in your worksheet. When you click on that button, it triggers a macro. To create a worksheet button that will trigger a macro, click in the worksheet where you want to place that button. Click on the Developer tab, and click on the Insert drop-down box. The first icon in the top left corner is a button. Click on the button icon. Your mouse cursor is now a crosshair. Click and drag to draw the button. When you release your mouse, you'll see the Assign Macro dialog box. Click on the macro that you want to assign to the button, and click OK. The button then appears in the worksheet. Now you can rename the button. It's recommended that you give the button then the same name as the macro, or a name that will remind you what the macro actually does. You can also drag on the button handles to resize it. When you're finished, click in the worksheet. The button is now clickable. Now, whenever you click on the button, it will run the macro. You can apply some customization to worksheet buttons and other shape triggers. To apply customizations, select the button. To do this, you'll have to right-click on it. If you just left-click on it, it will run the macro. Instead, right-click on it, and then select one of the options in the context menu. We're going to select Format Control. This brings up the Format Control dialog box. You can click through the tabs to apply different formatting options to your button. The Font tab gives you options to format text in your button. The Size tab allows you to change the size of the button. The Alignment tab allows you to align the text on the button. The Protection tab allows you to lock an item or lock the text. The Properties tab allows you to control the positioning of the button. The Margins tab allows you to set margins inside the button, and the Alt Text tab shows you the label for the button. Apply any formatting that you want to use using this dialog box, and then click OK when you're finished. If you've noticed, the one thing you couldn't change was the color of the button. When we go to Developer tab to insert a button, we're left with very few formatting choices. For example, grey is the only color of button we can insert, and it's always going to be either a square or rectangle shape. If we want to use buttons that have different colors and styles, or even other shapes as buttons, we need to first create a shape and then format it. Click the Insert tab, then go to Shapes, and then choose a shape that you want to use. Once again, your cursor is a crosshair, so click and drag to draw the shape onto your screen. We've chosen to use a rectangle, however you can use any shape you want, it doesn't have to be a rectangle. The Drawing Tools Format tab is now open on the ribbon. Apply a shape style to the shape if you want. You can also change the shape fill and outline colors. In addition, you can add effects such as a drop shadow. You can see our shape here. Now right-click on the shape and choose Assign Macro. Select the macro that you want to assign to the shape and click OK. That macro is then assigned to this button. Whenever you click the button, the macro will be triggered. Now right-click on the button and choose Edit Text. Add a text label to the button so you know which macro will be triggered when you click on it. You can also add buttons to the ribbon that will trigger macros. To do this, first go to File and then Options. Click on the Customize Ribbon tab. From the Choose Command From drop-down menu, where it currently says Popular Commands, choose Macros. You can now see your macros. Go to the Customize the Ribbon section. Choose the tab where you want to place your macros by clicking on it. Do not uncheck other tabs. This will cause them to not appear in your ribbon. We're going to choose the Home tab. Now you also have to select the group. However, you can't place the button in an existing group. Instead, you have to click on the New Group button. You'll then see the New Group Custom as highlighted in grey here. Click the Rename button that appears to the right of the new button group. Rename the group. We're calling ours Macros. Now select the macro that you want to add to the group. You'll select it from the field on the left. Then click on the Add button that's between the two fields. Click the Rename button again. Click on a symbol that represents the macro. You can also rename it if you want. Click on OK. When you've added all your macros and selected symbols, you can click OK to leave the Excel Options dialog box. Take a look at our Home tab. You can see our macros group to the far right of the ribbon. You want to use macros that are stored in your personal macro workbook for this. That way, whenever you open Excel, those macros are on your ribbon and available to you. In addition to adding macros to an existing tab, such as Home, as we did in the last section, you can also create your own tab just for your macros. To do this, go back to File, and then Options, and then Customize the ribbon. Click on the New Tab button here. Our new tab is then visible. Click on the tab to select it and then click on the Rename button. Name your new tab and then click OK. Now you can name the group that's included in the tab by default. Right now it's called New Group. You can also add more groups by clicking on the New Group button. Next, you can add macros to the group. When you're finished, click OK. You can then see the Macros tab in the ribbon. If we click the Macros tab, we can see our group. It's not recommended that you ever attempt to edit the Visual Basic code for your macros. However, just in case you ever need to, we'll show you the basics that you need to know in order to be able to make minor changes. Just be warned, anything outside of the basic editing that we'll teach you is a task best left for experienced programmers and not for the typical Excel user. If you mess up the code, you will require the assistance of a programmer to fix it, or you have to re-record the macro. To view and edit macro code, go to the Developer tab and click on the Macros button. Select the macro that you want to view and edit, then click on the Edit button. Once you click on the Edit button, this is what you'll see. The macro code is shown here. At the top, you see Sub Actual. Sub stands for subroutine. Then you see the name of your macro. At the end, you can see that the subroutine has ended. This is where it says End Sub. Everything between sub and end sub are instructions that the macro will carry out. Any line where you can see an apostrophe at the beginning, followed by green text, are comments. They are not actionable code. You can add more comments if you want. This is very basic and you're not going to hurt anything by doing this. Now let's look at the actual code, which is anything in the black font that's between sub and end sub. You'll see some of the code that appears between quotation marks, such as this section here. This is actually names for different variables or text that appears in our sheet when we run the macro. Sometimes you can edit the text that appears between the quotation marks. Other things that you may want to appear in your macro that you can easily change are the font type. Just type in a new font type such as Arial. Font size, where you can enter a new font size such as 14. True or false arguments. You can change an argument for true or false and vice versa. Range. If the range is .range A1, you can change it to another cell such as A2. An active cell. Right now, the active cell appears as ActiveCell.Formula R1C1, which stands for row 1 and column 1. You can change this to R2C2 for example. If you recognise anything else and feel comfortable changing it, then you can try to do it. Just remember that you may damage the macro in the process and can be forced to re-record it. When you're finished, simply click on the X to close this window in the top right corner. You don't need to do anything to save the changes. You can then run the macro whenever you want. Although it's not advisable that you attempt to edit the code for your macros, there is a circumstance where you'll be required to edit that code. If you want to add a confirmation box to a macro, you'll have to edit the code in order to create that box. A confirmation box is a box that will ask you if you're sure that you want to run a specified macro. This is especially helpful to have if you create a macro that deletes cells or data. Let's show you how to do this. Go to the Developer tab and click on the Macros button. Select a macro for which you want to create a confirmation box, then click on the Edit button. You'll then see your code. To create a confirmation box, we need to start out by adding an if statement. Click at the beginning of the first line of code. Press the Enter button to create a new line and move back up. Once you've done that, we can start to enter the code. The first thing we need to type is if. Then if we add a space, then type the word MSGBOX to create the confirmation box, which is short for message box. Add an opening bracket. We're then told what we need to enter next, as you can see here. The first thing to enter is a prompt. This is the text that the user will see in the confirmation box and ask them a question. Type in that question. Any text that will appear inside the confirmation box goes in quotes. We've customized this prompt to our macro, but your prompt can be anything you need to be. Next, select the buttons. We want yes and no, so we scroll down in the button drop-down menu to find yes, no. Double click on that to add it to the code. Add a comma. Next, you can add an optional title to your dialog box. We're going to enter warning. You do not need the rest of the parameters for a confirmation box. Add a closing bracket to your if statement. And then press Enter to go to the next line. You can see it's highlighted in red here, which means we're missing something. So go back to the end of the line and add an equal sign after the closing brackets. You'll see another drop-down menu. Double click on VB Yes in the drop-down menu. This lets Excel know to display the confirmation box. If the answer clicked in the confirmation box is yes, then run the macro. Add a space and type the word then. Press Enter. Next, at the end of your macro, but before the end sub, type the word end if. You might need to add an extra line in for this. Press Enter. You can now close out of the code window here. Go ahead and run the macro for which you created the confirmation box. I created it for the macro when I press this button here. You'll then see the confirmation box appear on your screen. We're going to click yes. When you click yes, the macro runs.